I'm Abdullah Schleifer, and I'm a resident here in Cairo, Egypt. I'm from New York originally. I was born in New York, grew up in New York, went to school in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania, came back to New York and lived and worked there for a couple of years, and then ended up overseas, and I've been living overseas for the past 40 years. I grew up in a middle-class Jewish family, Forest Hills, Long Island, Queens to some, but my family had social pretensions, so we never gave up the Long Island identity, you know, even though the Long Island Railroad ceased to be the main focus of transportation when they built a subway out there. And my family was, my parents were very kind, were not particularly observant. I guess what we would call, maybe every once in a while they go to Friday night services at a conservative synagogue. Basically, they went for the high holidays. They certainly did not observe kosher laws or, you know, what we would talk about when we say an observant Jew. An observant, when you say someone is non-observant, that doesn't mean they're agnostics or not practicing. It just means they're not practicing you know, approximately Orthodox practices, so they weren't. And religion was not something that was really terribly important in my family. In fact, there were certain subjects, I think, although it was never spelled out, one just grew up with, which were considered, they were not legitimate subjects for discourse: God, death, heaven, hell, sex, money. Well, of course, that happens to be just about touching on probably the most significant aspects of life and death, you know. But those subjects were sort of put aside. The strongest element, I mean, I was bar mitzvahed, and I don't think that had any particular significance, except it's interesting because the rabbi who conducted it, I didn't know this until many, many years later, happens to have also been, aside from being the resident rabbi of a, you know, very comfortable community, because Forest Hills evolved during World War II and right in the years after World War II into a very solid Jewish neighborhood. It wasn't when my parents moved there. When I was born, we were the only Jewish family and the only Democratic Party registered family in the block. But the demographics changed. And yeah, interesting is his name is Rabbi Zion Ben Zion Boxer. And it turns out he was a translator and scholar of Kabbalah and Hasidic literature, which is fascinating. I only discovered that recently because I've been doing a lot of reading in recent years in that area. My grandfather was religious. And I remember I spent a few weeks with him. He lived in Ossining, up the Hudson from New York. He was a retired painter, house painter, or an industrial painter. He headed up the Pennsylvania Railroad painting unit. And he had to retire in good air in Ossining because I think he had acquired arsenic poisoning, or lead poisoning, or something like that. And when my dad was a young man, they moved up to Ossining so he could go fishing and breathe air. And he practiced Orthodox Judaism. It was an interesting Orthodox Judaism, though, because it was largely self-taught. I spent a couple of weeks with him, and every morning we would go to the synagogue, and somehow I was impressed by that. I don't know what. I was young, maybe 12 years old. Maybe I was just impressed by the discipline of it, you know, or the fact that it was so different in what was important to him. It was so different than what I was used to, you know, in growing up in a sort of construction of modern American secular life. But I was impressed by it, you know. And as I said, I don't remember what. It's not like certain other things have impressed me spiritually, which usually the spirituality is manifested in aesthetic form, you know. And so I have very strong impressions, visual impressions, or you could say spiritually intuitive impressions, like of spiritual grace. No, I don't think so. I mean, I was impressed by, he had an earnestness, a moral seriousness that impressed me. And I remember I could say that was my first spiritual betrayal, because I came home at 12 and told my mother that I think I wanted to grow up and be a rabbi, having spent 2 weeks with my very devout grandfather. And she said, but then you can't have any more bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches. I said, really? I said, okay, well, forget that. And you know, so I mean, that, when I think of that, I think, oh my goodness, to have betrayed a spiritual impulse for a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich. How mundane, how banal. Anyway, what was interesting about him was that one day I noticed, we're sitting together praying, and I noticed that he's not reading the Hebrew, he's reading a transliterated Hungarian pony, right? As American Jews will read a transliterated Hebrew pony if they don't know Hebrew. And since I was studying for my bar mitzvah, I at least could follow the Hebrew, sort of. You know, I'd use the transliterated, but I could follow it. And I asked him about that, and he told me that he had no particular religious training as a young boy growing up in the countryside in Hungary, what was then Hungary, now Romania. It's Transylvania, which the Hungarians had to give to the Romanians after World War I. But when he immigrated, it was Hungary. He had no religious training at all. And it was when he came to America in the late 19th century and encountered anti-Semitism, which again, uniquely in Transylvania he didn't encounter. Many, many years later, in fact only around 15 years ago, talking with some Austro-Hungarian count who was here as an ambassador, did I find out that this area he grew up in was unique in Europe. It was the one place where Jews could own farmland and be farmers. And so they very quickly assimilated. And, you know, because his culture, that was the other thing that was interesting. His culture was distinctly Hungarian. It wasn't Polish Jewish or Russian Jewish like with other people, like with my grandparents on my mother's side who came from Russia. He was distinctly Hungarian. There was nothing Jewish. So he said because as a reaction to anti-Semitism, he got interested in Judaism, and he basically self-taught himself Orthodox Judaism. And that I found fascinating, you know. And I don't know why I found it fascinating, maybe because it just suggested the idea that there could be an individual religious impulse, you know, not just something you inherit, you know. I would say that basically, I mean, I could tell my story in many ways, but I'm telling it because you're interested basically in, let me put this on quiet, okay? I'll take it and put it on quiet. Hello?
Hello, Dr. Schleifer, this is Rania.
Hey, Rania. How are you? Listen, Rania, it's great to talk to you. Did you get my email? My 5 emails or 10 emails I sent you? With all the corrections?
I did, don't worry. I got everything. Thank you so much for...
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I don't think I thought about God at the time. You know, I think I was impressed by my grandfather's moral earnestness, the discipline of going to the synagogue every morning, the idea of putting aside a portion of your life for something that had nothing to do with either consumer pleasures or business or whatever. I mean, that just sort of impressed me as different, you know, and attractive. And I liked him very much, you know, although he was very different. My father, in many ways, you know, as often happens with the children of immigrants, distanced himself as much as possible. I mean, from his father. I mean, he loved his father, he looked after him, but in terms of their outlook, their Weltanschauung, in terms of their worldview, their perception of things. So I don't think I was thought of God. I don't think God really was something I particularly comprehended. I mean, I said a little prayer every night. My mom taught me. It was very nice. I don't know where she got it from. I don't think it's Jewish. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. God bless mother or father. Excuse me. So I don't know where she got it. I think it's very popular. Maybe she got it from some magazine or something. I think it sounds very American. It doesn't sound particularly Jewish. But anyway, no, I'll tell you, you know, the first time I think I had a sort of spiritual reaction was, yeah, so that prayer I said as a kid, I think what it meant was just something my mother wanted me to do, and I was happy to do it, and it was a good feeling of love for my parents, you know. But I really didn't have God consciousness. And even when I think of the first sort of something that got to me spiritually, I think it was more the manifestation of the sacred than the sacred itself. God, or the one, or the absolute, or the good, you know, whatever we want to call it. I was a freshman in college, and I joined the cinema club and started watching, you know, great films. And you know, this is the 50s, and a very interesting period in cinema. Anyway, one day I saw they showed Ivan the Terrible by Eisenstein, Ivan the Terrible Part 1. And in it, there's a scene in which, and of course, it just happened at that moment in Russian history, Stalin was very open to reconciling with the Orthodox Church, right? World War II was about to break, or it was already in it, whatever. And so the film, he probably identified with Ivan anyway, and the film, well, you sense that Ivan was an extraordinarily powerful, maybe cruel man, but you know, he was nevertheless the hero of the film. And the film has to do with his wedding, when he marries a princess. Only recently I discovered that princess was Muslim, interestingly enough. But you wouldn't know that from the film. And the wedding takes place in a Russian Orthodox cathedral. And I was deeply moved by the beauty of it. You know, it was a black and white film, Ivan the Terrible #1. 2 was, and it was beautiful. I mean, it had a spiritual grace to it, which is an example that several times happens through my life, which illustrates a theme, I think, that God finds you where you are. You know, and I was, you know, pretty agnostic, pretty materialist, so I'm finding this, I'm stumbling upon spiritual beauty in the work of a Russian communist, you know, in a film ordered up by Lenin, I mean by Stalin, you know, pretty bizarre, but that's life, you know, that's the way life is. And I was deeply moved by that. There was a sense of spiritual grace. And I don't know if you've ever been to a Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox service, but you know, it is very moving, very spiritual. There are no pews. It's like a mosque in that sense, except less formal. You could kneel, you could stand, you could, I mean, I've seen people make full prostration in a Russian Orthodox church when they first come in and they see, and they're in the center of the, what would be the equivalent of a central aisle. There are no aisles. There would be a stand with a crucifix, and I've seen full prostration even. So there's a great sense of a presence, a spiritual presence, which pews, it's very interesting. I wonder when pews were introduced into the, I wonder if they are a child of the Renaissance, of the Reformation. Because for me, the most powerful spiritual moment in Christian worship, or Orthodox Christian worship, is taking the sacrament in the Mass. And it's interesting, that's not in the pew. I mean, what impresses me, which is namely Roman Catholic and Anglican, where you go to the rail and you kneel. You're not in a pew, you're kneeling on your, kneeling on your knees, you're in an act of submission. Indeed, as you should, if you believe God is really present in the sacrament, at the very least you should be on your knees. I would be flat on my face, but anyway. So I was struck by that, so that's interesting. And I would say that's the first. Now, about that time, I started coming into the contact of fine arts students, architectural students. By accident, I was interested in, I was writing poetry. I submitted some to the Pennsylvania Literary Review, which was edited by a liberal arts major who hung out for some reason with architects, with students at fine art school. So I started hanging out with them. And that in itself was a very interesting introduction in two ways. One, it gave me a sense, let's see, how can I put this coherently? Suddenly, through their company, and also because of my interest in what they were interested in, I took the one course in my university career that had a great impact on me, and that was a course taught by Louis Mumford, The Culture of Cities. Louis Mumford, who must have passed away 20 years ago, was a brilliant scholar of the city, of city planning, of architecture, and particularly the transition from the organic city, what we think of as the medieval city, or the tradition, in all traditional cultures, but the medieval city, the city in which the sacred presence is paramount, where the city evolves around the cathedral or the Juma mosque or the Hindu temple, whatever, you know, and then everything else is concentric circles and organically around it, and how it makes way for the megalotropolis of the you know, of the industrial age and post-industrial. Brilliant scholar. He, for many of his last years, he was the planning and architectural critic of the New Yorker, and it was great studying with him and working with him and doing a paper for him. And so that was an opening to the medieval Western heritage, and simultaneously hanging out with these fine art students who I would describe as, at that time, used to be called Ivy League bohemians, all right? Which is basically, you know, you have what would be considered on the campus sort of bohemian taste, but they're still Ivy League. You know, you shower in the morning, you know, you wear tweed jackets, whatever, but you're bohemian. You're pursuing more than simply waiting for Friday night to roll around to get drunk at the fraternity house. You know, there's a commitment to art, to music, to the aesthetic life, and through that an opening to spirituality, all right? Not spirituality as clothed necessarily in sort of conventional religion that you inherit from your parents, but rather, and so it was an opening, and it gave me an insight into a world that, because I had no question, being second generation American, that I was American. I mean, there was no question in my mind. In fact, I remember how odd, I mean, and growing up in Forest Hills to be Jewish American, you know, the two were synonymous, you know, I mean, because we replicated American life. The only difference is people had names like Cohen instead of Jones and Green, but it was middle class, suburban, you know, we replicated it with a slight New York accent, that's all. But we replicated, you know, Protestant bourgeois life, especially in the 50s. My parents' ambition was for me to go to an Ivy League college, you know. They didn't quite understand why, but they knew that that was the ambition, you know. Suddenly I realized and discovered, because I started listening to music, you know, my parents are cultivated people, and I grew up in a home where, along with Broadway show hits, we would listen to Beethoven or Chopin or Liszt. And then I suddenly discovered, through my contact with these fine art students, none of whom, except for my friend in the literary magazine who introduced me, were of Jewish origin, and all of whom were delving into that Western culture did not begin in the 18th century. That there was something called pre-Enlightenment Western culture. And I understand why a Jewish American or Jewish European family, but especially Jewish American, and my time, remember, I was 10 years old at the time of the end of World War II. I remember we had a Christmas tree until 1945. I never thought to ask my parents, they're dead now. I'm convinced it was the discovery of the Holocaust, of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, that somehow made them convinced that they shouldn't have a Christmas tree, that somehow gave them a certain Jewish self-consciousness. Suddenly the Christmas trees disappeared when I was 10 years old, you know? And so I could understand, given the fact, the impact of being children of immigrants, of assimilating to, or integrating, if not assimilating, because they didn't, integrating to American life, the impact of the Holocaust, why you wanted to, you was on one hand supremely integrated into Western life as understood by America, which is also post-medieval, right? I mean, America itself has no past, it's white European past, not Native American, has no past that's earlier than the 17th century. You know, it's a Reformation America with some Catholics clustered around Maryland, you know. But I mean, basically that's what it is. There's no, the great age of faith is gone now, you know. So both the Jewish and the American reinforces this idea that Western culture begins with, I don't know, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, in which you close your doors to what I would find from a spiritual and aesthetic point of view, certainly architectural point of view, the greatest epic of Western civilization, which is medieval West. The West that gave us Chartres, Saint-Michel, Durham Cathedral, Bach, because even those Baroque musicians, they may have been performing in the 17th century, but their spiritual sensibility was in the 14th century, you know. They just happened to share that time, you know, but there's nothing Baroque particularly about Bach, quite on the contrary. I mean, you know, the Catholic Church considered him a saint, even though he was a Lutheran. And suddenly I was discovering this, that I had been raised, like, shielded from this extraordinary dimension of being a participant in Western culture. And the reason is because that culture is profoundly Christian. Because the West, I mean, today we say Judeo-Christian out of politeness, you know, but basically, fundamentally, it was a Christian, a Catholic culture. Not even Christian, we call it a Catholic. Catholics sometimes, some very hip Catholics will say, what is a Christian? I mean, we know what a Catholic is, but what is a Christian? You know, it was Catholic culture. And the Latin culture, the church. And it was the extraordinary culture that even into the Reformation would have someone like a Bach and a Mozart composing masses, you know, Latin masses. And even where, it's interesting that it's Lutheran Protestantism that contributes to the last gasp of that, not Calvinist Protestantism. You know, a Protestantism that's still relatively close to Catholicism, that believes there's some sort of presence in the sacrament, you know, that has a mystical dimension, unlike Calvinism. So, so for me, this was an extraordinary. So I would again say, I'm still not God conscious, but I'm becoming what you could say culturally conscious of cultures that are informed by the paramount spiritual virtues, right? Cultures which are infused with spirituality, very different than the cultures we inhabit today, the sort of post-Christian cultures in the West. And I found it beautiful. And I was, of course, acquiring a sensibility studying with someone like Mumford and reading the books and hanging out with fine art students and examining the, you know, the great architectural works in the medieval period. So that was an informative period. Again, it isn't God-conscious, but it's the cultural product of God-conscious times that I was drawn to, attracted, like the Eisenstein film. Now, about that time, again, God finds us in weird ways, I attended a Catholic Mass. And the reason was because I was spending Saturday night with this young Irish Catholic girl who was studying to be a nurse. And there was a sort of quid pro quo. She'd stay with me on Saturday night if I would go to Mass with her on Sunday. And well, that's very amusing on one hand. On the other hand, there's something I think wonderful about that, you know? I mean, that's the greatness of Catholicism. That's what brought. I mean, that, you know, okay, you may fornicate on Saturday night, but at least you pray on Sunday, you know, better than not to pray at all. I mean, you know, in the sense that there are worse things than sin, which is something that high-minded liberal secularists don't realize. And that is not acknowledging that there's a greater universe than ourselves is far worse than sin. Sin is to be human. To err is to be human. I mean, you know. So it's the darkness that accompanies the sun, the shadow that accompanies, you know. So although it's amusing, I'm very touched by her. Now, looking back 50 years later, you know, looking back or more, you know, that she did that. I mean, in a way, it's wonderful almost, you know. So I went with her to this Mass, and I was again struck by the drama of the liturgy, the beauty of the liturgy. It was in Latin, which is Latin is not a revealed language like Sanskrit or Hebrew or Arabic, but it's acquired the patina, I think, of revelation, even though it's not a language of revelation, by the fact that it's, you know, like pewter acquires a patina. You know, it's polished, and it's a very moving ritual, especially if the only thing you've ever seen before is either Orthodox Jews davening, which is not a particularly dramatic, you know, or let's say aesthetic experience, and maybe personally, inwardly, but not outwardly. It doesn't have an outer form that's beautiful. Or the sort of quasi-Protestant conservative synagogue of, you know, sitting in your, listening to a sermon. So that was interesting. And again, I was fascinated by it. I was drawn. I sensed there was beauty. You know, there's something beautiful here. I mean, God, I don't know what that's all about. As I sensed from that very moment the power of the sign of the cross, okay? Which eventually will take us to Sufism. I hope not too long, because I don't know how much film you have. And then about a year or so later, again, I met another girl, and this time the quid pro quo was even stronger, which was, you know, I had to convert, you know, I mean, that was the quid pro quo, right? And it didn't bother me at all, because, well, I mean, I sort of had an insight, I guess, into, you know, the ultimate logic of assimilation or integration. Sure, I mean, if I'm going to an Ivy League school, remember this is the 50s. Today that doesn't mean anything anymore, but in the 50s, the 50s was the last hurrah of elite WASP leadership in America. I mean, sure, you know, the Eisenhower year, I mean, sure, you know, 10, 15 later we could have a Nixon or a Bush, but I mean, that didn't mean anything. I mean, America's changed. Okay, this was so I said, yeah, why not? I mean, that's logical. I mean, you know, it'd be nice to be a Protestant, you know, I guess, you know. And she was a Presbyterian. So anyway, I got myself baptized. But I didn't comprehend God. I can't say I didn't believe in, it isn't that I didn't believe in God, I didn't not believe in God. I just couldn't comprehend God. What is God? I mean, but, you know. So part of it was the girl, part of it was social aspiration, social mobility, which in the 50s, I mean, this is irrelevant today in America, but in the 50s, clearly, you know, there were still quotas. I mean, still, you sensed there was this little fence if you really wanted to be a sort of Jewish WASP, you had to, and that was what it was all about. But also it was this other thing, which is the realization I had come that this profound culture that I'm part of, Western culture, had tremendous Christian roots. I didn't know much about Christianity at the time, so I was baptized, but I remember the first time I went to a Presbyterian service with her, I was sort of put off by it, compared to the Catholic service. I said, what is this? Sitting in these pews, passing around little grape juice. And then shortly afterwards, somehow, almost by accident, someone I knew at Columbia, I discovered Anglo-Catholicism. And Anglo-Catholicism is a movement that developed within the Anglican Church in the early, mid-19th century, an attempt to recover the pre-Reformation Catholic dimension of the Church of England. And so it stayed within Anglicanism or within the Episcopal Church in America, but the parishes would define themselves as Anglo-Catholic, parishes of the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church. And again, I was very open to it because I'm interested in poetry. At this time, I'm reading Eliot. T.S. Eliot was a profound influence on me, and T.S. Eliot became an Anglo-Catholic. And from writing the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and The Wasteland, suddenly he's writing 4 quartets and Burnt Notion and extraordinary invocations of a sort of anglicized Catholic take on life. And I was reading his essays, and so Anglo-Catholicism utterly made sense to me. Again, I didn't comprehend God. But the liturgy is beautiful, and it's in the language of King James, so it's the Latin Mass, but in a beautiful, wonderful English, the English of Shakespeare, Elizabethan English, Stuart English, I did that for a couple of years, and it was interesting because, as I said, I didn't comprehend God. I certainly didn't comprehend the theological concepts. I started reading then a lot about Christianity, about Catholicism, but I mean, I didn't really comprehend, initially, and yet, again, I was moved by the symbolic. I was profoundly moved by making the sign of the cross. And I couldn't understand it. I certainly did not have any profound appreciation of Trinitarian doctrine. And I probably almost said to myself, well, if I don't believe in God, but if I did, he's certainly not 3. I just had this sort of simple-minded, secular or Jewish understanding of the Trinity, or like a lot of Muslims have here, that people are worshiping 3 gods, which they're certainly not. It's a monotheistic, And when you read the Athanasian Creed, you realize that. Every sentence says, we believe in one God. But then in defining the nature of God, that's where Trinity comes in. But I found the gesture, the kneeling and the making, extremely moving. And only many, many years later, maybe 20 years, 25 years ago, reading the works of René Guénon, who, I don't know if that name means anything to you, but René Guénon is the father of what's called the traditionalist school in Western thought. And many of the people of the traditionalist school, although they keep their European names, actually became Muslims because they wanted to be Sufis. So to be a Sufi, you have to be a Muslim. And René Guénon was one of them. And he's the founder of the school. And he wrote a book called The Symbolism of the Cross, based on a saying of a great Egyptian Sufi sheikh at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, Sheikh Al-Aish, who wrote, "The Christians have the cross, but we, meaning the Sufis, have its secret." And the secret of the cross, of course, is, I mean, and you know, you realize this is a primordial symbol. I mean, it's at the heart of arabesque design, basically. You know, everything flows, it's the heart of geometry, the cross and the circle, you got it. And so all things flower from it. It's the heart of the cross of the, I forget what there's a way of describing the swastika, which was used in Hinduism for thousands of years. You know, it's a profound primordial. And basically what the Sufi sheikh was alluding to, what Guénon wrote is, and this is why it's relevant to Sufism, to Islam, but the Sufi who interpret it, which is that the verticality of the cross is a symbol of the transcendent God, all right? That's particularly of significance, the transcendent God in Judaism and in Islam. And the horizontal of God as an eminent in life. And that's why when you think of it, well, there's a profound logic for the crucifixion, because if you believe that God became man, there's no better place to put him than at the cross, at the intersection of the transcendent and the immanent, where God is both transcendent and they are hanging from the cross. So that was the meaning of, so the cross symbolizes the epitome of both transcendence and immanence, and which Sufism would assert is at the heart of the spiritual understanding of Islam. In other words, the legalists tend to make it very simply a transcendent religion and ignore the immanent aspects of it, which are there in the Quran, and which Sufism is the corrective to. Anyway, that's advancing my story. So, yeah, so I pursued that for a couple of years, except I thought it was sort of, it's interesting because I remember making confession, because you have confession in Anglo-Catholicism, my first confession, and I was sort of smart alecky about it, and almost snidely said to me, because that dimension was there, you know, I mean, I think you have to be a saint to experience what Saul of Tarsus did, you know, the sudden, you know, everything becomes clear, you know, the heavens part, lightning strikes, and you have this pure, total conversion, and suddenly you're St. Paul. I think a lot of people go through, you know, walking through embers, you know, a lot of time back and forth and bringing all sorts of baggage with them. I certainly did. Yeah, so I said, well, Father, I got a problem. My Father, you know, my students, I don't really believe in God. I mean, I don't really comprehend God, you know. And I said it both in truth, right? There I am in the confession, and as a smart aleck kid, you know, who's sort of gaming this thing. And he said, well, do you feel bad about that? And I hadn't thought of it. I reflected on it for a minute, seriously. You know, I took him seriously. Because as I said, it was simultaneously, I had the smart aleck dimension and simultaneously taking things very seriously. I said, yeah, I guess I do. I mean, it really would be wonderful. Because I think the Mass is beautiful. I think the church is beautiful. I love the church. It'd be wonderful if I could believe in God. So he said, all right, in that case, he's basically saying, oh, in that case, I'm not going to throw you out of the confession, but in that case, he said, pray to this God you can't comprehend that he'll give you faith. And to say this and say that, you know. And that was a very profound insight. It's interesting because I don't know whether you realized it, but there's something very similar to that in Islam. When the differentiation between submission and faith, between Islam and Imam, you know, that you could submit to something without necessarily believing in it, you know. That's sort of implied in the Quran, that when God says, don't call, speaking, I think, largely to the Bedouin, don't call yourselves believers. You've submitted, but you don't have belief yet. You know, in other words, submission is okay. That's fine. That's acceptable. But it's not faith. You know, it's not belief. So, but nevertheless, after a few years, I just felt it was sort of ludicrous. Even though he had a very good insight, but I wasn't ready for it, and so I drifted out of it. I drifted out of it. The next spiritual experience I had, and it's beginning to get closer to God, is I get out of school, I go to work for an advertising agency, Young and Rubicam, 1956. And in the 50s, advertising was like Wall Street in the 80s. That was a great, exciting turf where young Ivy Leaguers who wanted to make a fortune and went, okay? So instead of going to Wall Street, you went to advertising, and I did. And I had this old vision, yeah, I'll make $1 million when I'm 30 and retire to Provincetown and write poetry, or Martha's Vineyard and write poetry and literary criticism. That was my vision. So I started work there at a young age, and I was doing very well. And then I sort of got bored, and I started writing for the Village Voice, because I was in the village. And I wrote an article defending advertising in a weird way that anybody insightful in the industry would realize was not terribly positive. My thesis was, the article was, don't blame the butler. I acknowledged that the consumer culture that advertising played a major role was trashy. I simply said, well, don't blame us, we're just giving people what they want, which is not exactly a moral defense of the industry. Anyway, I wrote that, and the editors of The Voice were amused by it, because, you know, The Voice would tend to have sort of either leftist or bohemian perspectives, and here I was defending Madison Avenue, and they encouraged me to write for them. And I was bored with what I was doing, so on my free time, I would, you know, every other week or so, I'd turn in, mostly for the back pages, cultural stuff. And so one day, the editor, Dan Wolf, called me in and said, I was then Mark Schleifer. He said, Mark, there's an interesting poet who's just come back from India, and his name is Allen Ginsberg. And I had heard of Allen Ginsberg because I still was, you know, kept up reading poetry, and Howell had come out a year earlier. And he said, he's in New York, and we want you to interview him. And I didn't realize it at the time, but the interview I did with Allen is the first interview with Allen that ever appeared anywhere, to my knowledge, because there are now 2 anthologies out. I haven't seen them, but every year I Google my old name, Mark Schleifer, and I discover more and more stuff is going on the line. I mean, I haven't used the name Mark Schleifer since 1965, you know, except for my NBC radio work. Before the '73 war, they were not about to have an Abdullah Schleifer broadcasting, so I was Mark Schleifer. But other than that, everything I've written and published has been as Abdullah Schleifer. So, and I've discovered there are 2 anthologies of interviews out, one attributed to Allen, you know, because they use his name, but they're interviews with Allen Ginsberg, and the other interviews with Allen Ginsberg, and both interviews start with mine. It's the first interview. Because as soon as he got his advance, probably from Larry Ferlinghetti for City Lights Press, for Howell, he took off India. And he had just come back from India and Europe and whatever when I interviewed him. Now, Allen was an exceptionally amazing and seductive personality, both metaphorically and literally. In my case, metaphorically. And I really was just, and he, you know, he quickly acquired disciples because of that type of personality. I mean, he was a mentor, guru type. You know, like I remember he said, what are you doing? And I was very embarrassed to say, well, I'm in advertising. And he said, oh, you know, when I got out of Columbia and went to San Francisco, I had to support myself. That was my first job. I worked in advertising. You know, he had that ability to reach out and empathize with people and reassure them. So I did it. I quit Young and Rubicam and hung up my Brooks Brothers wardrobe and, you know, and just became a hipster, a beatnik, you know, whatever, hanging out with Allen and the whole scene on the Lower East Side. And it was something I fell into quite easily. In some cases, they were even the same locations. I mean, when I was a college student with the fine arts, we used to go to the Cedar Bar because that's where the New York painters were. You know, and there I'm back in the Cedar Bar now because that's where the New York poets were as well. I mean, you know, feeling much more it was our turf than as a college kid coming in, you know. And yeah, so I got very involved with it. Now, it's during this period that I have the beginning of God consciousness, I would say, of sensing there's a connection. Because even with the Mass, although the Mass is all about the real presence of God, I just couldn't, as I said, that was, I mean, I sense this extraordinary power and drama, but I just couldn't identify with it. And because I didn't even know why I loved making the sign of the cross. I mean, it certainly had nothing to do with God, a Trinitarian God or whatever. It was this religious symbolism without my knowing what the source was. Now what happened is I'm wandering around the Lower East Side. And now this is the early 60s. By the early 60s, the Lower East Side is mostly, there's some residual Polish presence, increasing Puerto Rican presence, hippie presence, very little, it's a handful of old Jews who never made it out, you know, basically, or their children left them behind or whatever. And one day I'm walking down 4th Street or whatever, and I hear what sounds like Hebrew liturgy drifting through the air, and it's a storefront synagogue, little basement, and I go down the steps. I was stoned at the time, but by now, as I said, I had drifted away from Anglo-Catholicism, and I was sort of exploring the idea of myself as the wandering Jew, you know, I mean, just checking everything out. And I go in and I sit in the back row. And what I didn't realize it was that day was Yom Kippur. I had no idea that it was. I mean, no. And they just barely had a minyan. 10 and 11 old men, whatever. And then something happened I had never seen in my life. And that was, I mean, at first it was fairly banal to my standards. I mean, certainly if you were a believer, it wasn't. It was very important. But I mean, I'm sitting as an observer in the back saying, yeah, man, these are my roots. I got to dig it, you know, I mean, that sort of thing. Was at a certain critical moment, 3 people face the ark containing the Torah scrolls. And they're open, the ark is opened. And then one person, who I assumed was the rabbi, but I've since been told it isn't the rabbi, it's the cantor who does it, took his hands, lifted him to his ears, and then made a total, complete prostration on the ground before the Torahs, the scrolls, right? And then he was lifted up on either side. And I'd never seen that before. And I was stunned because it was so obvious that he was putting himself in a state of total submission to the absolute, to God, the absolute, whatever we want to call. The aesthetic, the spiritual beauty of the gesture was undeniably linked to the idea of God, of a force greater than our mundane existence. That's where I would say the first real link happens in my life. Just seeing that and understanding it. The symbolism is so apparent, so undeniable, so clear. Needless to say, a few years later, getting off a Yugoslav freighter to have a cigarette in Casablanca, a freighter that will end up in Tangier, which was my destination, going to Tangier. Tangier was one of the watering holes of the Beat Generation. New York, San Francisco, Mexico City, Paris, Tangier. And sort of fleeing a life of radical politics that I had drifted into, because the Beat Generation was part of some of the Beat Generation, some of it, myself, Leroy Jones, Alan to a certain degree, were part of the New Left, the emerging New Left of the late 50s, early 60s. And I got deeply involved in it, probably because I've always been very political and come from a political family. So needless to say, standing on the docks while they were unloading freight from this Yugoslav freighter that we found passage on, and our destination was not Casablanca, but another 2 hours sailing time to Tangier, where it would end. Suddenly, I hear the call to prayer, the Muslim call to prayer. Now, if you don't have a microphone to distort it, the call to prayer in the natural voice, assuming someone has a decent voice, is very beautiful. It's very angelic. You know, it's heavenly. And I heard the call to prayer. And the next thing I know, the stevedores all leave their work and line up. And then in front of them is the imam, who's, you know, one of their own stevedores, but he will be the imam, meaning the leader of prayer. And lo and behold, he lifts his hands to his ears, as the cantor did in that synagogue a few years earlier. And after the recitation, standing, of some passages, which I had no idea what they were, but they were Quran, he and everyone else makes the full prostration, and makes it several times in performing the prayers. And I was stunned by that, because of course it took me back immediately to that scene in the village, the synagogue, and the opening of the tabernacle on Yom Kippur. It happens once a year, that prostration, only once a year. And here was happening, you know, and I quickly learned once I settled into Tangier, you know, in living among Moroccan Arab Muslims, that this happens several times, 5 times a day, that type of prostration, you know, that symbolic gesture. So yeah, that I'd say was a very, very important moment for me. And that would resonate. Because by the time I got to Tangier, I would say I was in a state of spiritual crisis. I had pursued intensely the sort of Rimbaudin dimension of Beat Generation life, which means there's an element of truth-seeking. It's not just pleasure-seeking, because you can find pleasure. You don't have to become a hippie to find pleasure, to be a hedonist, you know. So there is an element of truth-seeking, but you're seeking truth through experience, which in itself is interesting. It leads somewhere. But that pursuit of experience can take you anywhere. I mean, it can take you to murder, like Charles Manson, you know. I mean, same with drugs, with hallucinatory drugs. They can take you to hell as well as to heaven. Because they're not within a, you know, within a spiritual discipline. And you're opening yourself up to the psychic world. And there's a lot of flotsam and jetsam in the psychic world. And some of it's very evil and destructive. But the point is that it, yeah, so I was in a spiritual crisis because I could see that the Rimbaudin pursuit of experience, whether simply for a combination of immediate personal pleasure that has as much to do with the ego as it has to do with physical pleasure. As anybody who's been a sex addict would know, that ego satisfaction is probably as much or more important than physical satisfaction. You know, the element of scoring, of proving yourself, whatever. Basically, it can become very self-destructive. And after around 3 or 4 years in this scene, I mean, I had friends who were dying off of overdosing, of maybe holding up banks for the revolution, you know, whatever. So I sensed a certain self-destructiveness, and I sensed between the highs, the really depths of despair in one's loneliness and lows. And it's in that state that I found myself in Morocco. I didn't go to Morocco or Tangier because I was interested in Islam or the Arabs. It was just a watering hole, a very beautiful watering hole. I had passed through it for 3 days on my way back from Europe. Very early on in my involvement with Beat Generation, and stopped off to see Paul Bowles because I now had money to start a literary magazine, which I did, called Culture, K-U-L-C-H-U-R, as an Ezra Pound's A Guide to Culture. And I wanted Paul to contribute, and I was struck by the beauty, you know, the rampant beauty of traditional Moroccan life, the architecture, the dress, the you know. And I know a great sheikh who once said, he was talking about the spiritual life, that there are 3 doors to the spiritual life. And he said, one is metaphysics, which was certainly not my door. It's taken me years before I could begin to read metaphysical work. Simple piety, which again is not my door. Simple piety is something I try to acquire after faith, you know, not before. And the 3rd door is beauty, love of beauty. And there's a Platonic reason for it. As the Neoplatonists say, beauty is the manifestation of the true. And the true, platonically speaking, is God, what we call God in the Abrahamic tradition. So, yeah, so I didn't realize that what drew me in just those 2 days in Tangier to its extraordinary beauty had a, was a manifestation of a certain still residing spirituality of traditional life there, you know. So I come back to it, and I have this extraordinary experience, you know, on the wharf in Casablanca, and I'm on Tangier, and almost every day. And the scene in Tangier, if I wanted to, was we simply, the hippies there recapitulated, the beatniks recapitulated our scenes in San Francisco, New York, with pads. But the difference is now, for reasons of economy and maybe aesthetic sensibility, we're not living in the new city outside Tangier. We're living in the where the wealthier European expats who were there for little boys, you know, would live, or because they had to flee the anti-colonial revolutions of Africa, you know, would live. No, we were living in the Medina, in the old city. It was inexpensive. I mean, beautiful home, unbelievably beautiful houses, and they would turn them into pads. But I quickly said, you know, what's going on around us is extraordinary. It's very beautiful. And almost every day I would be engaged by something that I would find very moving. And I couldn't understand it. And I was not naive to travel. I mean, I traveled a lot. I lived in Cuba, Mexico, France, Spain, you know, but I mean, somehow I was being engaged. I mean, for instance, well, anyway, I know this is going for a long time, but I mean, almost every other day I would encounter something that would be striking to me. And invariably, when I try to track it down, it had to do, in the end, with people imitating the prophet or simply doing what they believe God tells them to do in the particular religious tradition, which is Islam. And a lot of this I learned, again, as I said, God finds you where you are, from my, basically, the Moroccan who was sort of the pusher, or I don't want to say pusher, that's a bad, you know, I mean, he simply, we bought our hashish from him, all right? And he was a nice guy named Mohammed, and he had some English and whatever, and he was a poor Moroccan, and it was a way of making a livelihood. And I sit with him in the Saco Chico, in the cafes, talking, and he was my commentator. He's the one who commentated, for whom I acquired my knowledge of Islam from, which is extraordinary, but it's true. I mean, things would happen. We'd be sitting there, and I remember the first decisive step I took towards Islam. I mean, it is so low on the level of, but it's funny, it's amusing. I just wrote about it yesterday. I was talking to the editor of the Daily News because I had to write about Bush. You know, this incident with the Iraqi journalist throwing a shoe at Bush. And the point I was trying to make was, the final irony is, Bush, who tried to make a joke of it, didn't realize how insulting it was. It was more a blow to his honor, to Bush's honor, than to his physical being. If the guy had thrown a stone, that would have shown more respect. If he had thrown a grenade, it would have shown more respect. It might have killed Bush, but it would have been an object of respect. But to throw you a shoe is an object of disrespect. For instance, a traditional Muslim will not sleep with his feet pointing towards Mecca. I don't understand it, but somehow the idea of feet is associated with lack of respect. You don't sit like that with people. You keep your feet here, you keep them under. You certainly don't sleep with your feet. Now you'll see people doing it because the tradition is dying. What remains now is fundamentalism, you know, a certain rarefied legalism and moralism, but the traditional culture is dying away. So you'll see people sprawled in the mosque with their feet. But 50 years ago, that would have been unheard of, okay? So that's what it's contempt, and it was contempt. A way of showing contempt to throw the shoe. So it was not lighthearted, it was far worse than lobbing a grenade. And so I use that as an analogy to some similar thing, you know, which is not germane to my story here, but it took place in Tangier. But what took place in Tangier that is germane to my story is I'm sitting with him one day, and he says, you know, you hippies think that you're clean and we're dirty because, you know, you have clean clothes and we have old clothes, but our clothes are clean. They're just old and we iron them and they have patches, but they're clean. He said, but really, you're the dirty ones. I said, what are you talking about, Muhammad? We're the dirty ones. He said, look at your underwear. It's stained. Our underwear is not stained. I said, no? He said, no. I said, why? And then he told me how Muslims wash themselves with water using their left hand. And they clean themselves off, you know, with water very effectively. It's not some sort of closed-eyed swipe with paper, you know, and therefore they almost never, a person would have to have, you know, diarrhea or something. I mean, never would a pious traditional Muslim have stained underwear because of this hygienic practice of washing yourself with water. I said, my God, that's very sensible. I started doing it, you know, and I was very impressed by that. I said, that's fantastic. What a basic, you know, insight into our bodies, whatever, you know, and things like that. I mean, really on a scale of spirituality, that's really very funky. But that's where I was at, and it really impressed me. I mean, the other things I want to get into, they're more graphic, but had to do with basic hygiene. Oh, well, this one. He said one day, he said, you know, because he knew he'd probably been with the girls. It was a very incestuous circle. Hygiene was not the height of concern among hippies. So there was a lot of, he probably took a continuous group of people to the pharmacy to get the medicine to treat pubic lice, all right, which happens when you have promiscuity and you're not bathing a lot and whatever. And he said, you know, we don't have that problem. I said, why? He said, because we shave that area. I said, you shave that area? He said, yeah, we shave that area. You know, again, that's at least in the Maliki rite, that's a traditional Muslim thing. The men as well as women shave their pubic hair and under their arms. So they don't have a problem of so again, that struck me as so, you know, wow, that's fantastic, you know. What I was struck by the consciousness of it, you know, consciousness, a sense of consciousness. You know, it was almost something I never would have associated with Islam, because you think of Islam, well, it's like Judaism, Christianity. It's something you think more of Buddhism, you know, where the minute act. But of course, in all traditional religion, I just didn't know this. It's not unique to Islam. You'll find it in Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Judaism, where the most minute act. Because why do we say grace before anything? Why do we say grace if you're an Orthodox Christian or a Jew? Why do you say a bracha before everything? You're not saying words, you're really reminding yourself of the God presence in every little act, whether it's eating or going to the bathroom or making love to your wife or your whatever, you know. God recognition, God presence, you know, God consciousness. And that's what redeems every little moment. So I never would have associated it with with Islam or Judaism, Christianity, but I took to it immediately, because you certainly encounter it very easily when you read about Buddhist practices, where brushing your teeth is a spiritual act, you know. Well, if you really are practicing traditional Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, it is too. It's just that that's been lost in the alienation of modern Western life. So anyway, things like that happened every day. I'd be sitting with him in the cafe at night, during the day, and a funeral party would enter the square, because the cafes were on a square, and they'd have a body wrapped in linen on a slab. You didn't have coffins. In traditional Islam, you don't have coffins. You have the slab of wood, the body completely wrapped up. It's already been cleaned and perfumed. And as they walked through, they were chanting. Now, I didn't know what they were chanting then, but they were chanting La ilaha illallah, with the first Shahada, which is sort of like the Muslim equivalent of the Shema, okay? It's a declaration of faith. And it's interesting, because I had no idea of the concept of spiritual struggle. You know, what in Arabic is in Islam is called the greater jihad, spiritual struggle, the struggle against the nafs, against the ego. I had no idea of that concept at all. Maybe a little from my readings in Christianity. You know, when you read St. John of the Cross, or, you know, Augustine, you know, you encounter it a bit. You encounter it, but certainly not. But I sensed, interesting enough, and I wrote a poem at that time, that these were warriors who had returned from battle, and they had lost one of theirs, but these warriors were not in tears. His loss was a triumph. You know, and somehow I sensed that this particular approach that these men had of, you know, they were chanting. They were sad, but they weren't crying, they weren't weeping, you know, and they were chanting something that obviously had, you know, great liturgical significance, that somehow it represented some sort of spiritual victory over death, you know. And that was the poem I wrote. And I said to him, I mean, I'm sure I didn't use those words because they didn't exist in the vocabulary, but I'm sure I said something like, hey man, when the body came into the meeting, everyone stood up. I stood up too. Mama stood up, you know, we all stood. Because around 4 cafes ringing the Sacro Chico Tenchi. And I said to Muhammad, this must be some really important dude. And he said, no, I don't know who he is. Probably nobody here knows who he is, you know. I said, then what are we standing for? He said, we're standing because we have to respect death. He said, you know, you're not a believer, but if you died and came through this square, everyone would stand for you, you know. Because we're not standing for the person who died, we're standing out of a consciousness and a respect of death. So something we have to meditate on. And that really knocked me over. Again, coming from a family that we never talked about death, I was, you know, to acknowledge death, you know, and treat it with that sort of somber respect. Amazing. I remember whenever I'd be with Muhammad and in the presence of his Moroccan friends, whenever someone would put out a pack of cigarettes, they felt compelled to offer it around. You know, you had to offer a cigarette to everybody. Now, in American culture, everyone carried their own cigarettes. You pull out your cigarette, you take it. If somebody else wanted to smoke, he'd have his cigarettes. If someone didn't, he might say, hey man, can you spare a butt? And you say, sure, have a cigarette. But you didn't, you know. And I realized that somehow that was connected with the fact that if I went looking for one of my friends in a popular, because we lived in the old city, we lived in, and it was amazing because it was so xenophobic. I mean, the Islam of 40, 50 years ago, I've said this in some New Yorker article, I said, I'm hard put to think of how people could be attracted today, a young Westerner seeking spirituality, given the almost opposite modes. I mean, one of the profoundly moving things was here I came to realize I'm living in a very religious culture. Everybody around me is praying all the time, doing this, yet they're living normal lives, and they're not xenophobic. Not once in that year did anyone, you know, because I would converse with people, not in Arabic, but in Spanish. Spanish was the lingua franca of northern Morocco. It had been Spanish territory. I would talk with, and some had English, like Muhammad. Never did anyone ever say a word about, they would presume your families were Christian. Or maybe if they were insightful, they would realize a lot of us hippies were Jews, you know. But never was a word ever spoken badly about Christianity or Judaism or insulting, you know. Never. That would be such bad manners. And the people were not xenophobic. Now, if you violated their privacy, if I went up on their roof, jumped from my roof to theirs, and started trying to hit on their daughter, I'd be in serious trouble. But as long as I did not intrude, you know, it was a tolerance born of certainty, not a tolerance born out of spiritual indifference where, well, let it all hang out. You could be a Muslim or a drug addict or a serial killer, or it doesn't really matter, you know. No, not that sort of tolerance, but a tolerance born of certainty. You know, they had a certainty about who they were, and, you know, I was very impressed by these things. And yeah, I was going to tell you this last story. So one of the things was I'd go into a restaurant looking for a friend, and it'd be like a popular restaurant, poor people, or ordinary Moroccans, serving soup. And I'd go from table to table. And each table I'd go to, the man singing his soup would say, tafaddal, meaning, come, share my food. Well, that's part of the mores of traditional Islamic religion. You know, you're doing something in public, you offer to share it. And it was like the cigarettes. And I came to realize this. One day, Muhammad and I were going to get some food at a grocery store and take it to my house and eat it there. We're going to have dinner there. So we're in a grocery store buying white cheese and olives and tomatoes and French bread and whatever. We're going to have a little... I noticed everything always gets wrapped up. You know, every little item would be wrapped up and then put in a bag. And I noticed that was part of the culture. And I said to Muhammad, what is this thing with wrapping, hiding everything, you know, wrapping it up? And I noticed you, Muhammad, even once when all we bought was a loaf of bread, even that you tied up in your sweater, you know. What is this thing? So he said, do you think I'm a generous man? I said, you are, Muhammad. You know, whenever you pass a beggar, you'd always have a penny for the beggar or something. He said, well, between your house and mine, we're going to pass maybe 10 men tonight who are going to go to bed hungry. He said, I do what I can, but I can't feed the world. I'm just you know, somebody who hustles hashish to the hippies. I can't feed the world. But what I can do, I can't feed those 10 men, but what I can do is not make them feel bad. Not stir up in their hearts something that's bad for them and for us, you know, envy, resentment, jealousy. No. So if I can't share it, I don't show it. You know, a profound insight said in very simple English into the whole idea of that consumption should not be conspicuous, that you don't inflame, you know, inflame jealousy, and that jealousy is not just a one-sided thing. You know, there's a cause and effect. You know, profound. I was, you know, really affected by that. And then I came to realize that all of these things were manifest. I'm almost at the end of my story. All of the things were manifest of living in a religious community. Now, I didn't see it at that time. All I could think of is I'm living in a unique community of believers who believe in this God they call Allah and this Prophet Muhammad, and everything comes out of that. And this is incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Well, in fact, if I had gone into some backwoods village in Greece, probably, you know, off, you know, real, because this was 50 years ago, I still would have found the same thing in that Orthodox village. Or, you know, if Hitler hadn't wiped out Eastern Europe Jewry, I might have found it in some, you know, I mean, but at that time, all I could think of is, all I know is New York, Paris, you know, San Francisco, and this, and, you know, and Geneva, you know, and this is something totally different. This is out of time. And I said, I know it's true. There's a truth to it, you know? I mean, because I could conceive of that there is a thing called truth, especially coming out of as I said, I'd gotten very involved in the New Left, Marxism, whatever, especially coming out of that world where you sensed a certain moral relativity that had nothing to do with truth, that 2 and 2 could be 5 or 3 or 4.5, whatever would benefit the revolution. It was the requirements of the revolution, the requirements of whatever your utopia is, whether it's the revolution or it's the, you know, or it's the caliphate with the fundamentalists, you know, whatever your utopia is, you bend reality to fit that rather than truth-seeking. So, because truth-seeking can take you anywhere, you know. It could tell you to just stay home, you know, and shut up. Or it could tell you to go out and lose your life. So I sense that this is all coming from people who believe in God. I can't comprehend God. And I really went into a state of deep depression because of that. I mean, I really was I was already in a spiritual crisis, coming to Morocco after having experienced the Stalinization of the Cuban Revolution and realizing, oh my God, it's all happening all over again. It's like darkness of noon, and it's, you know, it's a monster. When people talk utopia on Monday, there's a concentration camp waiting down the line on Friday. You know, that's the price of utopia. Because the man who thinks he has the capacity to make utopia for the millions is also ready to sacrifice millions, you know, for that vision, whether it's a communist vision or a fascist vision or, you know, whatever, or an extremist Islamist vision. So, yeah, so I felt very bad. And I really went into a state that clinically, in clinical materials terms, would be described as a nervous breakdown. And I understood it as a visionary journey to hell. Because all this, everything I suffered from in that state, the inability to sleep, burning, or fever, all are symptoms of hell, which I did not have implanted in me by a religious background. In other words, it isn't like I grew up on fire and brimstone. No one, heaven and hell, you never talked about that in my household. I didn't really read the Bible for meaning in English until I went to college. But I could recognize the symptoms because in college I started reading Dante and later, you know, and whatever. And then, you know, but I knew them as a literary trope. And now I was experiencing it. So in the end, I've come to appreciate that particular moment as what I would call a visionary journey to hell. And I know other people who've experienced that same thing. In other words, again, God finds you where he will. And, you know, some people are blessed with a vision of paradise and others, so I came out of it. I said, well, I still don't know about God, but I sure know that hell is real. Hell is real. It's there. I've tasted it. I've tasted it in this life. It's like a veil was lifted. And I saw into, you know, and my whole environment I perceived in the context of hell. I'm trapped here forever. I can't sleep. You know, I mean, it was very interesting. So coming out of that, I slowly make my way back to America. Slowly. The only way I got back to America, I had to go via Havana. That was the way I was taken. I finally get back to America. I'm back in America. And I remember the first day I get on a subway in New York. And so this is Satori on the subway, okay? I mean, that's how I'll chapter it. I'll title it when I finish my personal history. Satori on the subway. I'm on the subway, first day back in New York. And of course, you know, the thing about the New York subway is everybody's sort of sitting there, self-contained, right? I mean, to such a degree that if you look at another guy's newspaper, he gets upset. You're invading his privacy. Oh, look at you, what? How dare you read my... And nobody's recognizing anything. I mean, so some girl is standing there and some guy's like, you know, feeling her up. Nobody sees anything. Nobody does anything, you know. I mean, any number of odd stuff, you know. And the only person who talks to you is some crazy old lady who says, how are you, Sonny? Oh, a human being. Well, I'm fine, ma'am. Well, be careful because the Martians are coming tonight. So the only one who's even human is a lunatic, you know. And the sane ones are just utterly, you know, and or maybe some guy who's trying to hit on a girl will talk, you know, but I mean, but people do not engage in the sort of old-fashioned, polite acknowledgement, which you can still find in some British villages, you know, to this day, where people will say, good morning, good evening, how are you, you know, whatever, to semi-strangers or their neighbors. And then I remember getting on a bus. I used to travel the buses in Morocco because I didn't have much money. And in the bus, you get on a bus, it'd be empty. And then ordinarily, I would do what any good Westerner, polite Westerner does. You go sit a couple rows away from the driver. You know, you don't go sit next to him. I mean, what is that? That's weird. Then a Moroccan gets on, and he goes sits right next to the driver. He feels compelled he has to do it, just as we feel compelled, oh no, unless we're introduced, nobody exists. And he says, Salam alaikum, and the driver says, alaikum salam, and then they talk. And then another guy, he comes and sits next to the guy who's sitting as the driver, and you know, now they acknowledge each other. Now, they could end up killing each other. You know, maybe they discover from enemy tribes, and they pull daggers, but they're not killing each other as strangers. I mean, they've acknowledged each other as human beings, and that's very important. And so I sensed that at that moment. I said, my God, you know, and I'm still enough of a Marxist in a way to phrase it in my mind and saying, you know, this may be the future. You know, it's scientific, it's this and that, but this is not the way man is meant to live. And that other thing may be decadent and whatever, reactionary, whatever, but that's the way people are meant to live, you know? They're meant to acknowledge each other and, you know. And so I went home, this little flat I had on the Lower East Side. It was my second day back, and I pick up this copy of the Quran that I've been reading in English and getting nowhere with. First of all, Quran is not a narrative, all right? And Western culture is a narrative culture. We're used to reading things that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the Quran isn't. It isn't. It's organized arbitrarily by size. It has the components everywhere. You know, I mean, that's why there's a huge scholarship on trying to make a narrative understanding of which surahs came when and what. And what it really is a collection of divine flashes. You know, it's like in a literature, it's like flash, flash, flash. And that's why I think a lot of Westerners who become Muslims are very attracted to the story of Joseph. Because in the Quran, one of the longest narratives is the story of Joseph. And it's a fascinating story about Joseph and how he rises up and, you know, this and that. Or the story of Moses. You know, there are short narratives that last for a page and a half. And they're very attractive to us because they resonate with, you know, a biblical narrative. So I was getting nowhere with it as a text, as a narrative text. And I wasn't getting anything spiritually from it because the spiritual grace is in the Arabic, you know, and I'm reading it in English. But it's there. A majority of Muslims in the world who pray do not know Arabic. But they get something, just as you got it from the Latin Mass or from the Hebrew or from, you get it because there is something, I believe, implicit in a spiritual language that contains spiritual grace, as spiritual grace can adhere to a holy man or a holy spot, a sacred place. So it adheres to these languages that resonate with spirituality, either because they're revealed or they've acquired a patina. And again, I wasn't doing it. I wasn't reading it like an Indonesian Muslim who doesn't know Arabic, but when he says his prayers, he feels it here. He feels it. He experiences spiritual grace. So I was getting nowhere with it. So I came back and instead I treated it like the I Ching, you know. And I later found out that there is a Muslim equivalent of doing this. What I did, there is a, you know, tradition of one of the ways, and that is basically, you know, of getting an answer. What I basically said is, God, if you're there, you know, give me a sign, you know, give me something. And I closed my eyes and just flipped the pages and put my finger on the text. And there I read, and it appears twice in the Quran. It could be translated, know that God, that you cannot comprehend God, but God comprehendeth all. Well, I took that as a direct, you know, like, okay, right, you know, I can believe in a God who tells me that I cannot comprehend him. I got the message. So that's how I became a Muslim. I mean, you know, then a couple of weeks if I find some shaykh, you know, the rest of it is just sort of history. But that's how I became a Muslim. That's my story. No, I don't think so. I mean, people, by the grace of God, discover those messages. Maybe it's in my narrative. Maybe it's in somebody else's narrative. Maybe it's in, you know. It's like the things I discovered in Morocco, I could have discovered elsewhere. I didn't know that at the time. But I certainly would be an extraordinary ingrate if I were on that basis. You know, I mean, so I found my message there, you know, not Morocco, but the spiritual, the paramount importance of spirituality through my encountering of traditional, and I stress traditional Islam, in Morocco. And then as it unfolded to me from a particularly, one message I would say is that I think I've talked about things that one could say are so providential they border on the miraculous, all right? Like that sign I'm getting from, and I can just ask people who don't consider the miraculous to suspend their disbelief. This actually happened to me, this happened. That's why I think the personal narrative is very important. Because unless a person is a pathological liar, most people speak the truth. And so I would say the message I have is that the miraculous, which is the intrusion of absolute truth or of spiritual reality into our mundane existence, and thus extraordinary, happens. And I think it probably happens a lot, and it's just that we don't recognize it. Our eyes are close to it. It's like, if someone says something really outrageous, very often we don't hear them. We just block it, And what? No, he didn't say that. I mean, we don't even think that. Our subconscious thinks that. And we never heard it. It's just too outrageous. And I think it's the same thing with the miraculous. I have a suspicion that, I've mentioned some miraculous things that I consider stumbling into that synagogue, seeing that film by Eisenstein, encounters with the sacred in really bizarre circumstances, sitting with my pusher and finding out about, sacred hygiene. I think that happens, and we're blinded to it. And that's why you could say that's why people say, gee, well, so I would say that if you start seeing those things, you're already experiencing the grace of God, because it's almost like forgetfulness is a natural state. I constantly forget. I forget to make my prayers. I forget to do this. Forgetfulness. This is maybe, should be, okay, we'd probably come under sloth. It's probably one of the, you could say forgetfulness would come under the cardinal sins, the Western classification of the cardinal sins, sloth, laziness. So that my message would be is that there are messages all around us, and if we should pray that our eyes can be open to see them and benefit from them, and that those messages will take us to that aspect of the truth which is most applicable. I mean, now I see it a lot. I mean, there was a time when I first became a Muslim, I wouldn't use the word God, because that was still so incomprehensible. I would just say Allah, which is simply Arabic for God. Now, when I talk in English, I say God. I never say Allah. I only say Allah when I'm reciting a liturgical passage as part of my religious duties, and or I'm invoking the name of God as a Muslim. I invoke it in the liturgical language, Allah. But other than that, all my speech, I'm talking about God. I couldn't do that first couple of years. I was so, distant from the idea of, as I said, of God. I couldn't comprehend. Now I can see God everywhere. But at the same time, for instance, I will still go to hear if they're singing a Palestrina Mass, and I'm in New York or Philadelphia, and I see a Palestrina Mass is being sung at St. Paul's in Washington, I'll go sit the Mass. I still find the Mass an extraordinary experience. But I feel that the truth was revealed to me in its Muslim form, and that's where I feel, I can suspend disbelief, and I can appreciate the power of the sacrifice of the Mass, in Catholicism. I can appreciate that, but I feel at home in that form, which was the message that I received, which is making my prayers in Arabic and practicing my life as a Muslim, and doing remembrance of God, which is the fundamental methodology of Sufism, like it is of most mysticisms and most world religions, you know, the invocation of the name. As it is in Judaism. I mean, that's what you do when you lay tefillin, basically. You can't say the name, but you're remembering, you're invoking the name physically by tying tefillin. That's what you do when you take the Mass. What is the magical word that transforms wafer and wine into blood and flesh? It's when the priest says, and Jesus said to his disciples, take this in remembrance of me. And me meaning God, M-E, capital M. Jesus is speaking as God. Take this in remembrance of me. So the very Mass is what in Islam we talk about as dhikr, the remembrance, the invocation. So it's at the heart, I think, of probably just about every religious experience, some form of the invocation of the name of God. Even if God has no name, you're invoking that. You're invoking the namelessness of God, you know, in an Eastern... yeah, so that would be my only message. You know, look for your message. Or pray that your eye, because I'm not sure whether we can look for the message. Pray that your eyes be open to the message that is addressed to your heart, you know, which is the citadel of God. There's a saying in, I think it's prophetic, that God is, that neither heaven nor earth are great enough to contain God, are big enough to contain God, but the heart of the believer is.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.